All right, welcome back to our discussion of the 6 factors that could lead to, a developmental state, or a movement towards that end. Now, in the previous video, we already talked about 3 factors. Here, we're gonna check out the remaining 3 factors. Okay? The 4th factor here is the centralization versus decentralization of political power. We believe that centralization means the political power or the regime is controlled either completely or primarily by an individual or a family. Okay? Decentralization means there are multiple groups of interest or power. They actually share the ruling power, okay, with each other. And as you might already guessed, that a decentralization of political power is more likely to lead to a developmental state. Okay, because there are more checks and balances within the bureaucratic system. Okay? However, if the political power is completely controlled by an individual or a family, then all the policies they come up with are more likely just to maximize the benefit of their own instead of the general public. Okay? And when the power is decentralized, then there are multiple groups competing with each other. Okay? And you would find that at least one group would like to have the general public on their side. Okay? And usually this group is going to be the challenger. Okay? And they would come up with the policies or at least advocate the policies which can benefit the average citizens so that they can gain the general support. Okay? Anyway, the political power, centralized or decentralized, is a very important factor for a country to become a developmental. Okay? The 5th factor is the initial stock of human capital. Okay? In other words, how well educated the general public is. Okay? So this is not just about the intelligent capability of the ruling elite to come up with the right policies, but more importantly, we're talking about the general public. Okay? If they are better educated, then they can better help the government implement the policies, better cooperate, okay, with the government in terms of the implementation of policies. So the whole bureaucratic system or the public policy making and the implementation would be more effective. Okay? Also, if the general public is better educated, then they tend to have the more independent minds, so they would be more likely to check or challenge what the government does. Okay? So that would also help the government or restrain the government's power. Okay? All right. The 6th factor is external threats. Okay. Now, external threats means the threats from the outside of the country. Okay, from the foreign, either the competitors or enemies. Okay, if the external threats are too strong, this is for the ruling elite. It's like they're playing a long repeated game. That means if the external threats is too strong, then the foreign competitors or enemies may invade the country and take everything away from the ruling elite. So you know, the game is over, right? And if that is the case, the ruling elite might just think about, what's the quickest way they can take the property or the benefit wealth away from the general public before the foreign competitors come in and do that, right? So that's what the a developmental state won't do. Okay, if the external threat is too weak, okay, in other words, there's almost no possibility for the foreign invaders to come into the country and to take everything away, then the ruling elite could be, they don't have to worry about that, so they can just again take whatever, do whatever they want to do. Okay, again, that becomes a long repeated game. Okay, in other words, there's no tomorrow, no next week. Okay, they can just do whatever to maximize their own benefit. So putting together, we're gonna say if the external threats are neither too strong nor too weak, then this will become a repeated game. In other words, the ruling elite would behave from a long-term perspective, instead of the short-term. Okay, so they would be more patient. They would come up with the policies which can help the general public to be economically prosperous, okay, or developed, and so that they can see the benefit either politically or economically in the long term. Okay, and for the incentives for the ruling elite, as we already discussed, if the country is more developmental, okay, and how it comes up with the policies to help the general public becomes economically successful or prosperous, then the ruling elite would believe that the wealthier population is unlikely to join outside aggressors. In other words, if everybody, or at least most people, are happy with the way they live in that country, why not join the other ones outside, okay, and challenge their own government? It doesn't make sense, right? And also, the incentive for the ruling elite, for given the external threats, would be to strengthen their military against outside aggressors. Okay, and again, this is, as we mentioned before, something we saw during the Meiji Restoration. Okay. All right. So here, let's we already wrap up our discussion about these 6 factors that could lead towards the developmental end. Okay. Now here, as I said in the previous video, here I want to emphasize again that you're supposed to, for each of these factors, you're supposed to come up with a policy, okay, or something that the Meiji government did, okay, during the restoration, and then make your own judgment. Is that developmental or predatory? Okay. Again, at least one example for each factor. So totally you are supposed to come up with at least 6 examples. Of course, the more the better. Okay. All right, here we can provide a short or a brief summary of the achievements of the restoration. Okay. The first one is actually towards the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, Japan already had a highly centralized bureaucratic government. Okay. In other words, compared to the last shogunate, which was weak, right? So the Meiji government becomes stronger It could hold the country together. Okay, in terms of encountering the foreign competition. Okay, and they also had the industrialized economy with the latest technologies. Okay, now even at the beginning of the 20th century, Japanese firms were still the technological adapters, right? Instead of the innovators or inventors. They still copy and learn from the Western economies about the new technologies. Okay, but again, in terms of what they produce or the structural, I'm sorry, or the employment across the sectors, you would find that its industrial sector becomes much more important than before. Okay, now several short pieces of empirical evidence. The first one is because in the old days, like when we look at before World War II, we would say that even we have the GDP numbers, but these are just the estimates. Okay, we would expect that there might be some significant discrepancies when we go further back in history, right? So that's why here we also use more kind of the micro level or firm level or sector level statistics to show the economic development during the major restoration. Okay, the first one we look at here is the coal production. Okay, again, 1875. That's just several years after the beginning of the major restoration. Japan only produces 0.6 millions of tons of coal. However, after almost 40 years, right, in 1913, we find that Japan produced 21 millions of tons of coal. Okay, again, coal is super important in terms of industrialization. Okay, because it provides the energy or the driving forces of a lot of machinery equipments. Okay, such as the steam ships, right? And we could also look at the length of the trim track. Okay, again, because the transportation is another important component of industrialized economy. Okay, so back in 1872, Japan had only 18 miles of the train tracks, but like 4 decades later, 1914, it had already 7,100 miles of train tracks. Again, these statistics at the sector or industry level, we find they already increased a lot. Okay. And also, Japan has a well-developed infrastructure system, okay, in terms of the roads, telegraph services, and postal services. All of these we discussed before, right? It becomes much closer to what we saw in the United States or Germany, UK back then, okay, in early 20th century. And they also had a well-educated population, okay, in terms of the school enrollment rate. Okay, it's already much better than many other developing countries or Japan's neighboring countries. Okay, very close to the developed ones, or even above the developed countries, like the enrollment rate. Okay, and they also had the modernized army. Again, don't forget that's their ultimate goal of the restoration. And for the same reason, towards the end of the major restoration, we saw 2 wars Japan involved. one with China, one with Russia, and Japan won both of them.